In the summer of 1917, on a dusty training field at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, a small brindle dog with stub of a tail wandered through the gates. He had no collar, no owner, no purpose beyond survival. The soldiers of the 102nd Infantry Regiment, preparing to ship out to the bloodiest war humanity had ever seen, barely noticed him at first. But this dog, this unremarkable stray, with cropped ears and a stocky frame, would become something no one expected. He would become Sergeant Stubby, the most decorated war dog of World War I, a hero who would save countless lives and change military history forever. This is his story. The world in 1917 was burning. Europe had been locked in brutal trench warfare for 3 years. Millions had already died in the mud and blood of France and Belgium. Poison gas choked soldiers in their sleep. Artillery shells turned battlefields into moonscapes of craters and corpses. Machine guns mowed down waves of men before they could advance 10 yards. The United States had finally entered the war that April, and young men from every corner of America were being trained and shipped across the Atlantic to face horrors they couldn't imagine. Among those men was Private J. Robert Conroy, a young soldier from New Britain, Connecticut, assigned to the 102nd Infantry Regiment, 26th Yankee Division. Conroy was drilling with his unit at Yale Field when the stray dog appeared. The dog was small, maybe 25 or 30 pounds, with a brown brindle coat and a distinctive stub for a tail. His ears had been cropped short, possibly by a previous owner or maybe in a street fight. He looked tough, scrappy, and entirely unafraid of the soldiers marching around him. The dog began following the men during their drills. He watched them march. He sat at attention during inspections. He seemed to understand what was happening, as if he knew these men were preparing for something important. The soldiers, homesick and facing an uncertain future, welcomed the distraction. They fed him scraps from their meals. They let him sleep in their tents. And Private Conroy, in particular, took a liking to the little dog. He named him Stubby, after that truncated tail. Stubby quickly became the regiment's unofficial mascot. He learned to respond to bugle calls. When reveille sounded in the morning, Stubby would wake with the men and follow them to formation. He learned to sit when the soldiers stood at attention. Some accounts say he even learned to salute, raising his right paw to his brow when officers approached. Whether this was trained behavior or coincidence, it delighted the troops and became part of Stubby's growing legend. But there was a problem. Dogs were not allowed on military transports. When the 102nd Infantry received orders to ship out to France in the fall of 1917, Conroy faced an impossible choice. Leave Stubby behind or smuggle him aboard the SS Minnesota and risk court-martial. Conroy chose loyalty over orders. He hid Stubby in a coal bin on the ship as soldiers boarded. The dog stayed quiet, hidden among the supplies and equipment, as the transport pulled away from the dock and headed into the Atlantic. The crossing took weeks. Stubby remained hidden for as long as possible, but eventually he was discovered. A commanding officer found the dog wandering the deck and demanded to know who was responsible. Conroy stepped forward, expecting punishment. But instead of ordering the dog thrown overboard or confining Conroy to the brig, the officer reportedly smiled. Stubby, sensing the moment, raised his paw in his signature salute. The officer laughed and allowed Stubby to remain. The little stray had charmed his way into the United States Army. They arrived in France in early 1918. The 102nd Infantry disembarked at St. Nazaire and moved north toward the front lines. Stubby marched with them. He was no longer just a mascot. He was part of the unit, accepted by every man in the regiment. They were heading into the Chemin de Dames sector, one of the most contested and blood-soaked regions of the Western Front. The trenches were worse than anything the American soldiers had imagined. Mud sucked at their boots. Rats the size of cats scurried through the corridors. The stench of decay and latrine buckets was inescapable. Artillery shells screamed overhead day and night. Snipers picked off anyone careless enough to raise their head above the parapet. And then there was the gas. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. Invisible killers that burned lungs and blistered skin. The Germans used it without warning, releasing clouds that drifted over the trenches in the early morning hours. Stubby adapted to the trenches faster than many of the men. He stayed close to Conroy and the soldiers of the 102nd, moving through the mud and filth without complaint. He seemed to sense danger before it arrived. Soldiers noticed that Stubby would become agitated before artillery barrages, barking and running to the dugouts. His hearing was sharper than any human's. He could detect the distant whistle of incoming shells before the men heard anything. They learned to trust him. When Stubby ran, they ran. Then came the gas attacks. On a cold February morning in 1918, German forces released a cloud of poison gas toward the American trenches. It drifted silently, hugging the ground, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. The sentries didn't notice it until it was almost too late. But Stubby noticed. He had been exposed to gas during a training exercise back in Connecticut, a small, accidental exposure that had left him sick for days. Now, in the trenches, his sensitive nose detected the chemical scent long before the men could. He began barking frantically, running up and down the trench line, nipping at the sleeping soldiers and pulling at their blankets. The men woke in confusion, but Stubby's panic was unmistakable. They grabbed their gas masks and sounded the alarm. Within seconds, the entire trench was awake and masked. The gas rolled over them, but thanks to Stubby's warning, not a single man in that section was killed. Some sources estimate that Stubby saved dozens, possibly over 100 men, in that single alert. He had become more than a mascot. He was a sentinel, a guardian with abilities no human possessed. But Stubby himself was not immune. During one gas attack, despite the soldiers' attempts to protect him, Stubby inhaled enough chlorine gas to incapacitate him. He was rushed to a field hospital where doctors and nurses worked to save him. For days, Stubby struggled to breathe, his lungs scarred by the chemical. The men of the 102nd visited him when they could, bringing treats and encouragement. Against the odds, Stubby recovered. The experience left him even more sensitive to gas. From that point forward, he could detect it at concentrations far too low for humans to smell. He became the regiment's living gas alarm. Stubby's duties expanded. He began accompanying patrols into no man's land, the deadly strip of cratered earth between the opposing trenches. At night, soldiers would crawl out to repair barbed wire, gather intelligence, or retrieve the wounded. Stubby went with them. His low profile and keen senses made him invaluable. He could hear enemy movement in the dark. He could smell wounded men lying in shell craters, men who would have died without help. Stubby would locate them and bark to alert the patrol, leading soldiers to injured men they never would have found on their own. One night in April 1918, Stubby was on patrol in no man's land when he heard something unusual. It was a faint rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. Stubby froze, ears forward, nose twitching. Then he bolted toward the sound. The soldiers in the patrol tensed, unsure what had triggered the dog. Moments later, they heard barking, then shouting, then a scream. When they reached Stubby, they found him clamped onto the rear end of a German soldier. The man had been mapping the American trench positions, a spy operating behind enemy lines. Stubby had caught him trying to retreat and had brought him down, sinking his teeth into the man's leg and backside. The Germans surrendered, terrified and humiliated. The Americans captured him, recovering maps and intelligence documents that revealed planned attacks. Stubby had single-handedly captured an enemy combatant. The story spread through the regiment, then through the entire division. Newspapers back in the United States picked it up. A dog had captured a German spy. It was the kind of story that boosted morale on both sides of the Atlantic, a moment of levity and triumph in an otherwise bleak war. Stubby's fame grew. Soldiers from other units came to see him. Officers posed for photographs with him. He was no longer just the mascot of the 102nd Infantry. He was becoming a national symbol. But the war was far from over. The 102nd Infantry fought in some of the most brutal engagements of the American Expeditionary Force's involvement. They participated in the Aisne-Marne Offensive, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest and deadliest battle in American military history. Stubby was present for all of it. He endured artillery barrages that shattered trees and buried men alive. He survived sniper fire and gas attacks. He was wounded by shrapnel from a German grenade during an assault, metal fragments tearing into his chest and leg. Once again, Stubby was rushed to a field hospital. The wounds were serious but not fatal. Surgeons removed the shrapnel and bandaged him. He spent weeks recovering in the hospital, where he became a favorite among the nurses and wounded soldiers. His presence lifted spirits. Men who had lost limbs or suffered burns found comfort in petting the small dog who had fought alongside them. When Stubby finally returned to the 102nd, he received a hero's welcome. The men had feared they'd lost him. His survival felt like a good omen. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, Stubby had served in 17 battles and 4 major offensives. He had been wounded twice. He had saved countless lives through his gas attack warnings and his work finding wounded soldiers. He had captured an enemy spy. He had boosted morale in the darkest moments of the war. And he had done it all as a stray dog who had wandered onto a training field by accident. The men of the 102nd Infantry didn't see Stubby as a dog. They saw him as a soldier, a comrade who had earned his place in their ranks. Before returning to the United States, the women of Château-Thierry, a town the Americans had helped liberate, made Stubby a special chamois coat. It was tailored to fit his small frame and decorated with the emblems of the 102nd Infantry. Soldiers began pinning their own medals and ribbons onto the coat, a tradition that would continue for years. Stubby's coat became a patchwork of honors, a wearable record of his service. When the 102nd Infantry returned home in April 1919, Stubby marched with them. He led the victory parade through Washington, D.C., strutting at the front of the regiment as crowds cheered. Newspapers covered his arrival. Magazines published his story. Stubby met Presidents Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, and Calvin Coolidge. He attended Georgetown University Law School with Conroy, who had enrolled after the war and became the Georgetown Hoyas mascot. He performed at halftime shows, charming audiences with his salute and his antics. Stubby's fame continued to grow. He was made a life member of the American Legion and the Red Cross. The Humane Society awarded him a gold medal. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, personally decorated Stubby and promoted him to the rank of sergeant, making him the first dog to receive rank in the United States Armed Forces. The YMCA commissioned a special medal for him. He was invited to events, parades, and ceremonies across the country. But fame didn't change Stubby. He remained loyal to Conroy, who cared for him for the rest of his life. They traveled together, attended events together, and lived together in a modest home. Stubby grew older, his muzzle turning gray, his movements slower. He carried the scars of war on his body, and in his lungs, the lingering effects of gas exposure never fully leaving him. On March 16, 1926, in Conroy's arms, Stubby died peacefully. He was approximately 10 years old. His death was reported in newspapers across the country. Obituaries honored him as a hero, a soldier, and a friend. The New York Times ran his story. The nation mourned. But Stubby's legacy didn't end with his death. His body was preserved and mounted by a taxidermist, a common practice at the time for famous animals. His remains, along with his decorated coat, were donated to the Smithsonian Institution. For decades, Stubby was displayed at the National Museum of American History, where millions of visitors saw him. Children pressed their faces against the glass case, marveling at the small dog who had gone to war. Veterans paused to salute. His story was told and retold, passed down through generations. In 2018, nearly a century after his service, Stubby's story reached a new audience. An animated film titled Sergeant Stubby, an American Hero, was released, introducing his legacy to children and families around the world. The film took creative liberties, but the core of Stubby's story remained true. He was a stray who became a hero. He was proof that courage and loyalty aren't determined by pedigree or circumstance. They're choices made moment by moment in the face of fear and danger. Stubby's influence on military working dogs is immeasurable. Before him, dogs in war were rarities, novelties, mascots at best. After him, the military began to recognize the strategic value of canines in combat. Dogs could detect things humans couldn't. They could go places humans couldn't. They could perform tasks that saved lives. Stubby paved the way for the war dog programs that would emerge in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. Today, military working dogs are highly trained specialists serving in bomb detection, search and rescue, and patrol duties. They are honored and respected as soldiers. That tradition began with Stubby. There are memorials to Stubby around the United States. Statues, plaques, and exhibits commemorate his service. The Connecticut state capitol displays a brick from the trench where he served. Georgetown University maintains his legacy as their mascot inspiration. And at the National Museum of American History, Stubby remains on display in the Price of Freedom exhibit, his small frame frozen in time, his coat still adorned with the medals he earned. But perhaps Stubby's greatest legacy isn't in memorials or museums. It's in the countless lives he saved and the spirits he lifted. It's in the soldiers who went home because Stubby warned them of gas attacks. It's in the wounded men pulled from no man's land because Stubby found them in the dark. It's in the morale he provided to troops facing unimaginable horror. Stubby didn't understand strategy or politics. He didn't know why the war was being fought or what the stakes were. He only knew loyalty. He only knew that the men who fed him and cared for him were his pack, and he would do anything to protect them. In a war defined by industrial slaughter, by machines designed to kill with maximum efficiency, a small stray dog reminded people of something essential. Courage doesn't require training. Heroism doesn't require orders. Loyalty doesn't require a reason. Stubby embodied the best qualities humans aspire to, the qualities we often fail to live up to. He asked for nothing in return, except perhaps a scrap of food and a kind word. The soldiers of the 102nd Infantry never forgot him. Long after the war, veterans would gather and tell stories about Stubby. They remembered how he slept curled up against them in the cold trenches. They remembered how he barked to wake them when gas drifted over the lines. They remembered his stubby tail wagging when they returned from patrols. For many of them, Stubby represented the good they found in the war, the moments of joy and connection that sustained them through the nightmare. J. Robert Conroy never married, and some historians believe his bond with Stubby was the defining relationship of his life. Conroy kept Stubby's memory alive, bringing him to events, telling his story to anyone who would listen. After Stubby's death, Conroy ensured his legacy would continue. He donated Stubby to the Smithsonian not for fame or recognition, but so future generations could see what a dog, just an ordinary stray, could become when given the chance. Stubby's story challenges our assumptions about intelligence, about value, about what it means to serve. He had no training before the war. He wasn't bred for combat or selected for his abilities. He was a stray, a mutt, the kind of dog most people would walk past without a second glance. But when given purpose and treated with respect, he rose to meet every challenge. He learned. He adapted. He excelled. He became a sergeant, not because of favoritism or nepotism, but because he earned it through actions that saved lives. The Great War killed over 17 million people. It destroyed empires and redrew maps. It introduced weapons of mass destruction and industrialized killing. It shattered the illusion of progress and civilization. In the midst of that darkness, a small dog named Stubby provided light. He didn't end the war. He didn't change its outcome. But he changed the men he served with. He gave them hope. He gave them something to protect beyond their own survival. He gave them a reason to smile in the trenches, even when death surrounded them. Today, when we look at Stubby's preserved form, in the Smithsonian, we see more than taxidermy. We see a testament to the bond between humans and animals, a bond that transcends species and circumstance. We see proof that heroism comes in all forms, that courage isn't measured in size or strength, but in the willingness to act when others need you. We see a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones no one expected, the ones who chose themselves for greatness simply by refusing to quit. Stubby never asked for medals or parades. He never sought recognition or fame. He simply did what came naturally to him. He protected his pack. He served his purpose. He loved the men who loved him. And in doing so, he became immortal. His story will be told as long as people remember the First World War. His legacy will continue as long as dogs serve alongside soldiers. His spirit will endure as long as we believe that loyalty, courage, and love can overcome even the horrors of war. Sergeant Stubby, the stray dog from New Haven, the hero of the trenches, the most decorated dog of World War I, reminds us of something we too often forget. We are not defined by where we come from or what others expect of us. We are defined by what we choose to do when it matters most. Stubby chose to stay when he could have run. He chose to warn when he could have stayed silent. He chose to fight when he could have hidden. And because of those choices, made moment by moment in the mud and blood of France, he became something greater than anyone imagined. A stray dog became a sergeant. A forgotten mutt became a legend. And a small act of kindness from Private Conroy, feeding a hungry dog on a training field, became a story that would inspire millions for over a century. That's the power of compassion. That's the power of giving someone, anyone, even a dog, a chance to prove their worth. What do you like about this animal? Tell me your favorite animal war story I should talk about next. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.